Forget 1492. Almost 5 centuries before European galleons ever anchored in the Caribbean, the Atlantic had already been crossed. But the first Old World arrival in the Americas didn't end in a triumphant conquest. It ended in terror. A crew of Scandinavian fugitives and outlaws successfully navigated to the North American coast, built homes, and prepared to stay. And then they packed their remaining supplies, ran back to the ice, and left it all behind. For generations, scholars assumed this early expansion was purely folklore. But as we look at the excavated wooden ribs of these massive ocean-going vessels, the myth evaporates into archaeological proof. These ships could and did cross the ocean. Because no permanent charts were drawn and no trade routes established, the Norse arrival remained a local secret. Without a connection to the rest of Europe, this world-changing milestone was reduced to an unverified rumor for a millennium. The origin of this forgotten colony actually starts with a murder. In the late 10th century, a man named Erik the Red was banished from Iceland after a bloody feud, forced out to sea with a small band of followers. With no home to return to, Erik steered his ship straight west into uncharted waters, hoping to find a landmass sailors claimed to have seen in distant fog banks. What he found was not a sanctuary. He hit a massive, frozen expanse, a territory buried under thousands of feet of creeping glacial ice, with barely enough coastal moss to feed a cow. But Erik needed a kingdom. Knowing nobody would willingly move to a frozen wasteland, he orchestrated a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation. He named his newly claimed territory Greenland, hoping the label would lure farmers out of Iceland. The lie worked. A struggling colony took root on the edge of the ice, barely clinging to survival. And it was exactly this desperate environment that pushed Erik's son, Leif, to venture out again and stumble into a world they could barely comprehend. Years later, while sailing back to the Greenland colony from Norway, Leif Erikson was caught in a brutal North Atlantic storm. Relentless winds pushed his wooden ship far to the south, blindly tossing the crew for days, until the waters suddenly calmed. They washed up on a shore that must have looked like a hallucination. Instead of jagged rock and endless ice, Leif stepped onto soft black soil, surrounded by thick timber and deep green grass. The crew eventually wandered inland and found something that should have been impossible this far north: wild vines bursting with grapes. In awe of this agricultural bounty, Leif named the region Vinland. Leif had accidentally discovered an environmental utopia. While his father had lied to create a fake Greenland, Leif had navigated straight into a genuine paradise on the North American coast. The news sent shockwaves through the starving Greenland settlements. Soon after, a merchant named Thorfinn and his wife Gudrid organized a return expedition, determined to turn Leif's discovery into a permanent home. They didn't treat this as a quick raid. They brought 160 men and women, livestock, and heavy tools. They laid foundations and built sturdy sod houses, digging into the earth to establish a functioning, long-term town. During that first mild winter, Gudrid gave birth to a son named Snorri. He was the first European child born in the Americas, marking a new stage for the colony. It was no longer just a group of visitors, but a home. The atmosphere in the camp shifted. These were people raised in a culture of blood and iron, but in Vinland, the swords stayed in their scabbards. They transitioned into farmers, builders, and parents. For one brief historical window, an independent, peaceful European colony was thriving on the coast of North America, totally severed from the politics of the Old World. This peaceful isolation ended one spring morning when the settlers looked out to find the harbor crowded with a fleet of canoes. They were not alone in this land. The native inhabitants, who the Norse called Skraelings, quickly clashed with the settlers. The skirmishes were fast, brutal, and completely overwhelming. The Vikings were routed. The Norse possessed iron weaponry and steel blades, but the technological edge meant nothing. Their martial culture simply couldn't save them. The settlement wasn't defeated by the environment, but by the math of isolation. They were a handful of families at the edge of the known world, facing a population that could replace its losses indefinitely, while the Norse could not. Traumatized and bleeding, Thorfinn and the surviving colonists loaded their ships and fled. Despite the wealth of the land, they vowed they would never return. They sailed back to Greenland. They chose a life of slow starvation and freezing rock, deciding sheer survival in a wasteland was better than the constant threat they faced in paradise. By walking away, they severed the physical link to the continent. No trade routes were formed, and no maps drawn to bridge Europe and the Americas. Without a physical anchor, the memory of Vinland began to drift. As the original settlers died out, the story of the lush land across the ocean transformed from a geographical fact into an oral tradition. It became a saga. For centuries, European scholars dismissed the accounts of Leif Erikson and Thorfinn as poetic fiction, a fairy tale invented for long Arctic nights. The reality of the crossing was hidden in the ink, waiting for modern archaeology to confirm it. History isn't necessarily written by the people who cross a barrier first. It is written by those who have the logistical power and the numbers to stay. A medieval colony existed in North America 5 centuries before Columbus, but the world forgot it ever happened, simply because the Vikings blinked first.